From New York City across the continent to San Francisco, it's 3,000 miles or more. 3,000 miles from coast to coast. Today, we can span that distance in a few hours. By train, we can do it in less than 3 days. By truck and auto, it takes less than a week. Down through the ages, man's progress has always been closely linked with the way he has been able to overcome the tremendous obstacle of distance. In North America, it hasn't been many years since transportation was as primitive as it is possible to get. The Indians used only their own legs and their backs. They did not even know the basic invention of all land transportation, the wheel. Because travel was so slow and difficult, Indians lived in widely scattered tribes. They were isolated from each other by the natural barrier of distance. By the time Columbus reached the New World, civilization had been coping with transportation problems for thousands of years. But progress had been very slow. The voyage of Columbus represented a great advance, yet his ships depended on wind for their power, and were not much different from those the Egyptians had been using for more than 6,000 years. The European civilization, which took root in the new land, brought with it 3 basic inventions: the sailing ship, the wheel, and the beast of burden. These were vast improvements over what the Indians had known, yet transportation, especially on land, was still slow and laborious. So the main towns of the New World grew up at natural harbors where ships could land. Carriages and wagons provided transportation within the towns, but transportation between towns was slow, dangerous, and expensive. From colonial New York to Boston, it usually took 6 days, when the roads were good, and when they were muddy, well, it took much longer. Yet the nation's growth required better land transportation for passengers and freight. Although wagons and coaches were improved, the key to the further development was the building of good roads. In 1776, the main roads hugged the coastline, connecting the harbor cities. But in 1802 began the building of a national road, westward from Washington, over the mountains to Ohio, and then on to the Mississippi. By 1804, a network of inland roads began to take form. Away from the roads, transportation was still primitive. Pioneers used Indian canoes, certainly not the best means of commercial transportation. But on the quieter waters that flowed into the Mississippi, large rafts called flatboats were loaded with produce by enterprising settlers and floated downstream to New Orleans and other river towns. A one-way trip that often took many weeks. Only a light cargo could come upstream, laboriously poled on small keelboats. So the great Mississippi system, which blessed the interior of the continent, had to wait for a new invention before it could come into its own as a transportation highway. The invention came. It harnessed the immense power of steam. One of the first uses for steam power was in water transportation, where the rivers could serve as roads. One of the earliest steamboats was like an oversized rowboat, using a steam engine instead of strong backs. it wasn't efficient. The same inventor also built an experimental screw-type steamboat. A paddle wheeler, Robert Fulton's Clermont in 1807, was the first commercial steamboat. The impact of the steamboat is hard to imagine today. It worked a near miracle in life of the growing nation. For the first time, it was possible to travel into the interior of the continent in comfort, indeed in luxury. The increase in travel was astonishing. By 1840, more than 100 passenger steamboats sailed the Hudson River alone. But it was on the Mississippi River system that the steamboat came into its own. No longer was commerce limited to downstream travel only. Keelboats disappeared, but the economical flatboats stayed on. The river cities flourished. Some 4,000 steamboats docked at Cincinnati during the 12 months of 1848. New Orleans became one of the world's great trading centers, with steamboats arriving and departing all day long. The Mississippi River steamboats were carrying 10 million tons of freight a year, nearly double the nation's entire foreign commerce. In 1819, the Savannah had become the first steamship to cross the Atlantic, and soon others were built. Most famous was the giant luxury liner, the Great Eastern. Now energetic businessmen began to build canals to connect the river routes. The spectacular Erie Canal from Albany to Buffalo linked the Atlantic Ocean with the vast Great Lakes system. It was the Big Ditch, the Grand Canal, gateway to the West. 365 miles through hills and actually over rivers in an aqueduct. In its first year of operation, it brought in over $750,000 in tolls.
I've got a mule, her name is Si, 15 mile on the Erie Canal. She's a good old worker and a good old pal, 15 mile on the Erie Canal.
The Erie Canal, spectacular though it was only one of many which were made economical by the feverish growth of transportation and commerce brought on by the steamboat. From 1830 until after the Civil War, the nation's commerce moved on the big rivers. The steamboat race between rival captains was a sport at the times, but sometimes the results were disastrous.
Help! Help! Save all those women and children!
Away from the big rivers, transportation problems were as great as ever. Freight wagons were slow and cumbersome. Bridges were almost non-existent, and roads were few and very poor. As the nation moved westward, the need for improved land transportation grew. Steam power was hard to use with land vehicles. The big problem was road friction. Even a combination land and water machine, the amphibolus, was tried without success. Optimistic inventors tried using wind as a free source of power. But road friction was the major problem. Inventors came up with an answer. Rails used with horse-drawn wagons. Thus, one or two horses could do the work of many. In the early 1800s, several such railways were in use. Steam-powered railways were slow to develop compared to the speed with which steamboats were adopted. The Tom Thumb was one of the famous early engines. It pulled a brigade of double-deck coaches modeled after the familiar stagecoach of the day. These early trains could travel at the staggering speed of 15, sometimes even 20 miles an hour. By 1830, the steam railway had proved its worth. New railway construction now began in earnest, and the nation began to take to the rails as it had to the steamboat. For the first time, there was a semblance of comfort in overland travel, except for noise, jolting, and hot cinders. For the first time, it was safe to continue traveling overland at night. And passengers, if they could, might get some sleep. In the 10 years between 1830 and 1840, almost 3,000 miles of track were built. By 1850, the total had tripled to about 9,000 miles of track. By 1860, it had more than tripled again to more than 30,000 miles of track. Like the steamboat, the railways had their share of accidents.
Help! Save us! Save all the women and children. Oh, and here. No! No!
But accidents didn't seem to hinder their phenomenal growth. In fact, cartoonists made light of railroad accidents by suggesting ways to avoid them. After the Civil War, railroads became the prime movers of the nation's commerce. Unlike steamboats, they were free to go wherever they could lay their tracks. They could move right through the city to the very doors of the big shippers. Steamboats found it hard to compete with this kind of service. In 1869, the first transcontinental track was laid, pushing west from Omaha and east over the Rocky Mountains from San Francisco. The two lines met in a roadless wilderness of Utah, and the nation rejoiced. That meeting marked the end of the steamboat age. Now railroad travel and commerce flourished as the nation grew. Chicago became the jumping-off place to the west. The railroad station became a center of community life, not only for the cities, but for every little town. By 1880, there were 93,000 miles of track. By 1900, the total had jumped to 200,000 miles, and by 1920, the peak of railroading, there were 250,000 miles, statistics that few had envisioned at the historic meeting in Utah. The United States became a railroading nation. The Iron Horse, as the steam engine was called, became an object of story and song, of poetry and art. The names of railroads acquired a romantic ring. The Cape, the B&O, the Missouri Pacific, the Southern Route, the Erie, the Rock Island, the New York Central, the Wabash, the Pennsylvania, the Seaboard, the Atlantic Coastline, the Louisville and Nashville, and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. In less than a century, transportation had made more progress than in all the thousands of years that had gone before. But the age of the railroads was soon to be challenged by other forms of transportation. That story is told in another film.